And I'm going to give you guys a little insight into some of the sermon planning process that I went through. Usually in fall, the year before, I plan out the preaching for the year, right? I look at the calendar and I plan it out. So in 2025, I went to the calendar and I planned it out. And when we got to the book of Hebrews, I planned for it to go all the way through August. But we finished last week. So now I'm in a bind. I'm like, my calendar didn't work. What am I going to do, right? I planned, but God's really the mastermind of it all anyway. So now I got to find a sermon. I was like, you know what? Hebrews was super deep in theology, right? Almost every sentence of Hebrews needs to be unpacked to a degree. So let's do something that's a little more devotional. Let's look at a story. Let's look at the story of somebody where we can look at an example. But I need 5 weeks, so that means it's got to be a short book of the Bible. It's got to be a short story. And that brought me essentially to Ruth, the book of Ruth. And I was struggling with this. I was fighting with it. I didn't want to do the book of Ruth. And you guys are kind of probably thinking at this point, why don't you want to do the book of Ruth? I'll tell you why. It seems like a book for women. Right? See, you're laughing because you all know that deep down you kind of thought that too. Like, isn't this a book for girls? I feel like when a small group or a Bible study starts up for women, they do the book of Ruth at some point. I've never in my life seen a men's Bible study do the book of Ruth. Hasn't happened. In fact, I saw a really renowned, huge presence, mega church pastor talk about Ruth, and he was saying, if this was a movie today, it wouldn't be an action movie. It wouldn't be a thriller, it wouldn't be a mystery or a spy movie or a comedy, it would be a chick flick. I'm like, I guess in a way that's true. Here's a lady, she doesn't have a guy yet, but she just happens to meet some handsome looking farmer. Right, as you see, this is exactly how Ruth plays out. Then the mother-in-law decides to orchestrate some sort of scheme to get them together. And then towards the end of the book, there's another guy that might marry her instead, but then that falls apart. So then the handsome farmer and the heroine get together, and then they have a baby. It's a chick flick, isn't it? But guess what? The Bible was not written to women. The Bible was not written to men. It was written to humanity. And so the truth is, even though the heroine of the story is a female, and even though the supporting character, the other one, is also a female, the truth of what the story is communicating is for every single one of us. And the reason is because every one of us has struggled with this type of scenario at some point in time. We've gone through tragedy. We've gone through loss. And sometimes it seems like over and over again, all of the setbacks happen, and we ask ourselves, where is God? And because we're so focused on the situation at hand, we can't see the invisible hand of God working behind the scenes. And so this is a book of hope. This is a book of encouragement, that even if we can't see the hand of God working in our lives, He is. And He's working it out for His purpose and His plans. So with that, let's go ahead and open up the book of Ruth. We're going to start at the beginning because that's what you do when you read a story. So let's go to Ruth 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. All right, so there's the setup to the story. And like all stories, that's thick with a bunch of drama. But a lot of us, when we read that, we don't necessarily see the drama that's embedded in the story. But believe it or not, every single one of those details, everything from the places, the time and the setting, and also the situation of the sons, it all matters and adds up to explain the situation that Ruth is in. So we got to kind of unpack some of that so that we understand truly what's going on here in the story. When the Bible says here in the opening, in the days when the judges ruled, They're referring to a specific period in Israel's history. And in fact, if you do have your paper Bibles, or even if you're scrolling on your phone, if you just gently swipe down, you'll see that the first book, or the book before Ruth, is called Judges. That's what it's talking about. It's talking about that book. So in reality, the story of Ruth, happens kind of in the middle somewhere in the book of Judges. So what was happening during the Judges period? The Judges period is Israel's low point. It is a time of moral chaos. In fact, it tells us at the beginning of Judges and the end of the book of Joshua that during Joshua's reign, right, he took over after Moses, that during Joshua's reign, everything was fine. Israel kept the covenant with God faithfully. It was a high point for Israel, but as soon as Joshua and his generation died, everything went to moral chaos. And by the way, this is only 50 to 70 years after Moses took them out of Egypt. So then they descend into a time of absolute moral chaos. Crime is high. Murder is high, right? Other very bad sins are high within the community of Israel. They're also being conquered by all kinds of different people from outside, the different tribes, like the Moabites, town of Moab. They come into Israel, they conquer them, they make them slaves. Then God will raise somebody up called a judge to kind of help Israel out at that time. Think Samson, right? Think Gideon. Those guys to come. But it's a time of absolute chaos. In fact, it is so bad in Israel that the story of Judges ends with the 11 tribes descending down to the tribe of Benjamin, about ready to commit genocide on that tribe. They almost got wiped out. So during this time, you're talking crime, you're talking civil war, you're talking oppression from outside people constantly coming in and invading. So it's a very dangerous, very, very dark period for them. And that's the chaos that's taking place. So this puts them in a precarious situation. Because here they are now, the family is in Bethlehem from Judah. And in Bethlehem, there's a famine. So when that famine happens, they've got to choose to go somewhere else so that they can get food. And instead of choosing somewhere safe, they choose to go to Moab, one of the places that had come in and militarily conquered portions of Israel, but also that Israel had gone to war with as well. And this is all during the same time. And so as they go to this particular place, there's another layer to the danger that they're in. They're immigrants. They're called resident aliens. And so the resident aliens would have a certain amount of rights when they came to a place, but certainly not the full rights of the citizens. And they certainly had more than other wandering travelers. But the problem that they're in is that when they go to Moab, they are now completely at the mercy of the Moabites, the people that they've been at war with, that Israel has been at war with in the book of Judges. So that's already kind of a scary situation that Naomi finds herself in. But she has her husband and she has her 2 sons. So then she goes with them, right? They all go. But while they're there in Moab, her husband dies. Now, normally this would put her in a pretty dangerous situation because back then it was kind of a patriarchal society, right? The legal privileges, the security, income, property ownership, all of that resided with the male of the household. But she still has her 2 sons. And so because she still has her 2 sons, she's okay. But her 2 sons married 2 Moabite women, which is really interesting. They didn't marry Israelites. They married women from the tribe that was oppressing them and that they were at war with at different times. But 10 years later, her 2 sons die. And all she's left with now are her daughter-in-laws. And her 2 sons die without giving her any children. What the author is trying to tell us about Naomi is that her life, for all intents and purposes, is essentially over. It's done for. For a widow in this type of situation, an old woman with no kids, with no grandkids, with no husband, has no opportunity to do anything at all whatsoever. So when we say that Naomi was now facing a time where her entire life was falling apart, it is no joke. She is in one of the worst situations that a person, particularly an elderly woman, could find themselves in. So what does she decide to do? Verse 6 tells us the story. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. So in those 2 verses, we see a couple of things that the author, I'm actually going to call him the narrator. Because the reason I wanted to call him the narrator is so that we can imagine that there's somebody who's commenting on the story that's unfolding, right? So imagine we're watching a movie, this is going on with Ruth, and then the narrator makes a comment over that. So what the narrator now says here is that over in Bethlehem, the Lord had brought food back to that land, right? This is one of 2 times that God is given credit for doing something in the book of Ruth. Only 2. And we'll see the next one in just a minute here. So he says that God has returned the bread, the grain, back to Bethlehem, which by the way means house of bread. All right. So God has restored Bethlehem that had a famine back to being the house of bread. So Ruth hears about this. She knows it's her hometown, and she decides, maybe, just maybe, I can have an opportunity by going back to Bethlehem. And the reason is because in Israel, there was a law for the poor, right? That when farmers, whether it was grapes, whether it was olives, whether it was grain, whatever it is, food that fell off onto the ground or was left on the vine after all of the picking was left for the poor. And then the poor were able to come through and gather the wheat. They were able to gather whatever was left on the vine. That's called gleaning. That was commanded in Israeli law. It was a way for them to provide for the poor. So practically speaking, she's saying, maybe I can go back to the place that I was from, and when I go back there, I can glean and I can at least get food. But her plan isn't glamorous. She's still living in poverty the entire time and never seeing a real future for herself. But that gives us a hint, by the way, that God is at work. It might seem like it's coincidence, right? Oh, there happened to be a famine. Okay, there was a famine. Then all this bad stuff happened to Naomi while she was far away. But then all of a sudden now, food is back in Bethlehem. That's a clue that the narrator is giving us, that, by the way, even though Naomi doesn't recognize it, God is at work in this situation. And so then she decides to go back, right? And as she goes back, she starts the journey with her 2 daughters-in-law. And this is in verse 8. We're going to read through verse 10. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant to each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then they kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." This dialogue opens up with one of the most beautiful things that is taking place in the book of Ruth. Because what Ruth is doing here is showing love to Naomi. Naomi is showing love to Ruth and to Orpah right here, but it's a special kind of love. It's actually a Hebrew word called chesed. Let's go ahead and put that up on the screen. I think it's there. Now, when we say chesed, we got to get that in the back of our throat. It's going to be chesed. Chesed. All right, perfect. Bless you. I like that. Thank you. I appreciate that. The concept of chesed is important to understanding the story of Ruth, but there is no English word that we can translate from it, because chesed is a big concept word that would be used, and we have to use a whole bunch of English words to try to describe what chesed is. So chesed is absolutely, it's love, it's faithfulness, it's commitment, and it's service to somebody else. That's what it is. But it's even more than just those 4 things, right? It's also a service a love, a commitment, a service that goes above and beyond the call of duty. Something that is kind of unreasonably required, but you still do it, right? And it's especially really good chesed when the person has no opportunity to repay you back. And in a culture that rested on reciprocity, like paying back good for good, that is huge. So what Naomi is doing for Ruth and Orpah is displaying an incredible amount of chesed. She is old. She's not going to be able to glean from the vines and pick up the harvest and all of that like she would have been able to in her youth. In reality, she could use Naomi and Orpah's help to see her through these last days of her life. But instead of saying, yeah, come with me because I need you, I'm old, instead, I want you to go back. I want you to go back because I want what's best for you, even though it comes at great cost for me. And she tells them this: I want you to go back, find husbands of your own. And she even prays a prayer of blessing over them, that the Lord gives them husbands so that they can find rest. Again, hinting back at the idea of security, right, for women being tied to having husbands and kids, which I'm going to be saying that a lot because that's kind of important to the end of the story. So she shows an incredible amount of hesed to these two women. Why? Because she loves them. But then the girls turn right around and display an incredible amount of hesed right back to her. Listen to what they say now in verses 11 through 13. They said to her, nope, we're going to go back with you and your people. Naomi's going to start to argue in just a minute. But the girls, they turn around and they say, no, we're committing to you. We're going to go with you. So here they're showing a tremendous amount of hesed also. Because now they're basically saying, yeah, we're going to stick with you and we're probably never going to find husbands again. We understand that. They're displaying hesed because they're now consigning themselves to a life of poverty attached to Naomi when they go back and just glean. They're being realists. They know what they're going into, but they're showing the sacrificial type of commitment. And it goes even more. They're doing this at great personal risk. Remember, this is at the time of the judges. There's a verse in Judges 5 that talks about the roads in Israel being completely abandoned because there were bandits everywhere. So when they decide that they're going to walk from Moab back to Bethlehem, they are taking extraordinary risk of being kidnapped, of being robbed, whatever it is. But these girls commit to Naomi. But Naomi says, no, you can't do this. This is insanity for you. And so she lays it out for them. This is in verse 11. But Naomi said, return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons? Who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I'm too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. Listen to this. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. Whew. What an incredible discourse from Naomi. But what I want to show you really quickly is that Naomi is laying out a perfectly reasonable argument for them. It's practical. It makes total sense. And its logic is airtight. Absolutely airtight. Why? She says, don't come with me, guys. What are you talking about? Like, if you come with me, I'm not going to be able to find a husband for us to be attached to a family. But then she goes even further. And even if I did find a husband, I'm too old to have kids, which means I could never give you guys sons. So why would you attach yourselves to me? But then she goes even further. But even if I did have kids, right? So impossible, even more impossible, even more impossible. Even if I did have kids, are you really going to wait for them to grow up so they can marry you? None of this makes sense. Don't do this. Go live a better life for yourself and don't attach yourselves to me. I am a sinking ship. And the reason she has this attitude is because of this last line here. No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than you, because the Lord's hand is against me. That is the crux of this whole scene. Naomi's life has truly fallen apart. There really is no hope for her, pragmatically speaking. And because all of these disasters have happened over and over again and have accumulated to this point, she has no other conclusion in her mind that God has put his hand against her. And I am going to argue that, you know what? I don't think that's an ancient history problem. I think it's something that a lot of us deal with. That when we go through tragedy, we ask God, why? Why is this happening to me? And when tragedy happens and when setbacks happen over and over and over again, we go back to God and ask him, why? What are you doing? What do you have against me? When we feel like blessings that should be ours are being withheld or taken from us. When calamities hit. When all of the setbacks come at once, we think God is punishing us. We think his hand is against us. I would wager that most of us have been there at a particular point in our lives. And even if we think God is not against us, like maybe that truth is still back there in the back of our heads, emotionally we still come at it like, why God? Why me? And I can be honest with you right now, even as a pastor, right? As a guy who's believed his entire life, I've been in that place. I've never been the type to actually like blame God necessarily, but I have actually been there like, why God? Why are you doing this? I thought you spoke. I thought you promised. I thought you led. But here I am. What is happening here? We tend to think that when things go wrong, it's his fault, that he's causing it. But the craziest part about this story, and this is the narrator's whole point, Naomi's argument is sound, it's airtight, it makes sense, the logic follows, all of it, but it could not be any more incorrect. Because that's not actually what's happening behind the scenes of the natural world. The reason she's completely incorrect is because she's not walking in the mystery of tragedy. See, that's the reality. We live in a tension of tragedy and redemption. We see suffering. We walk through stuff on our own. And when we're walking through it, going through it, we have to be able to walk in the middle of the redemption that's coming in the future while we're going through the tragedy right now. And she wasn't doing that. And so instead of looking forward to what God is doing or the plan that he might be working behind the scenes, she wrongly concludes that this is all God's judgment. She cannot see what God might be doing behind the scenes or how he could use this for his plan and for his glory. In fact, she's not even open to the idea that God could be working on something even bigger. This is wild. Check this out. God has already intervened by ending the famine. You remember I told you there's only 2 places in the book of Ruth, 2, where God is given explicit credit for doing something. One was ending the famine that we just read, but the other is at the end of the story in Ruth 4:13. And I know, spoiler alert, I'm going to give it to you, but I feel like 3,000 years is enough leeway. At the end of the story in Ruth 4:13, it says this, the Lord enabled her, which is Ruth, to conceive. Remember I told you, childbearing, marrying, that's a big theme in this book. The Lord enabled her to conceive. So I want you to think about this. When Naomi was in Moab with Ruth and Orpah and her 2 sons, they were married for 10 years. And during those entire 10 years, no children. 10 years of infertility. And then those 2 die. So from Naomi's perspective, and probably rightly from Ruth and Orpah's as well, they're looking at this situation and saying, well, I guess we are never going to have kids. But in chapter 4, it says this line that the Lord enabled her, Ruth, to conceive. Well, who did she conceive with? That handsome farmer that we talked about earlier, right? Boaz. Boaz and Ruth do get married. And when they get married, they have a son. Who is that son? Well, that son is the grandfather of King David. Think about this for a minute. If Ruth had conceived with one of Naomi's sons back in Moab, we wouldn't have King David. Now, as Christians, let's extrapolate that even a little further. If we don't have King David, we don't have King Jesus. Interesting, isn't it? This is why we titled the series, More Than Coincidence. Because in reality, the things that we see are not the things that God sees. And God might be working something bigger than our own circumstance. He might be working something for an eternal plan. Do you think that Naomi and Ruth had any idea that they would be the matriarchs of the Messiah? Do you think that they had any idea that Ruth would be the grandmother of King David, who, by the way, would effectively end the period of Judges, bring law and order to Israel, unite the 12 tribes, and expand its territory beyond anything it had been before and ever will be? That's what God was doing. That's what God was working. But because Naomi was so focused on her circumstances, she couldn't see what God was doing. And this begs a lot of questions for us, right? So wait a second. Does this mean that God was causing all of these things? Was God causing the infertility? We can even play with this a little bit further, right? Did God cause the famine in Bethlehem so that they had to go to Moab? And when they were in Moab, did God cause I'm not reading it, but we'll just call him Mr. E. Did he cause Mr. E to die? Did he directly cause the two sons to die? Did he cause the infertility? Did he cause the journey? Did he do all of this on purpose? But guess what? The story never tells us. That's why it's called walking in the mystery. We walk in the mystery of the tragedy and the plan of redemption. I don't know what God is doing. Could God have caused all those things? Absolutely. He's sovereign. He can do whatever he wants. Absolutely, he can do that. Did God allow it to happen and then work all those purposes out for his good? Yeah, he does that too. But the point is, from our human perspective, we don't get that privilege. We have to walk in faith through the tragedy for the hope of the redemption that even if we don't see his hand moving, he's still working something out. That's the mystery. And we can be confident as we see the story of Ruth that that is exactly how God works behind the scenes. And no matter what we're going through, God is calling us and working and building our faith and our strength in him as we hope in that plan for redemption. The story continues in chapter 1. This is verse 14. At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So now it's Ruth's turn to give Hesed back to Naomi. And now it's Ruth's turn to lay out an argument that cannot be refuted, not because of its logic, but because of its Hesed. When Ruth says these things to Naomi, she is giving herself to lifelong commitment. See, when Orpah left, Orpah wasn't doing anything wrong. In fact, the narrator kind of assumes that we would all agree with Orpah, that she's doing the right thing, or at least the wise thing to do. So she's not bad. She's not doing anything wrong. But what that does is magnify the degree of Ruth's Hesed for Naomi. When the Bible says clung to her, that is the exact same Hebrew phrase for back in Genesis 2. For this reason, a man will leave his family and cling to his wife. Same Hebrew phrase. And that's the idea that the narrator's telling us. I mean, isn't that what Naomi said? She says, no. I'm going to leave my people and I'm going to go with you. Your people will be my people. In fact, I'm going to abandon my gods and your God will be my God. In fact, I'm going to cling to you till death do us part. She's committing her entire life to being faithful to Naomi, knowing that Naomi could never pay her back, knowing that Naomi is, in our perspective, a sinking ship. But because of the love, Ruth decides to stay with her. And so they returned to Bethlehem. When they returned to Bethlehem, here we are in verse 19. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Don't call me Naomi. I don't know why I got choked up there. But this is a powerful line. Don't call me Naomi, she told them. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. So why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. So when they return, the whole town is actually excited. That's kind of what it means by buzzing, right? Everybody's, wait, is that Naomi? Not from like is that Naomi? But more like, guys, that's Naomi. She's back. So there's excitement that she's returned. But when they see her, they call her Naomi, and she says, don't call me Naomi, which by the way means lovely, which means beautiful. She says, don't call me that. Call me Mara, which means bitter. Names back then were a big deal. Nowadays, we choose names based on how they sound, right? The parents like the sound of the name, or I like that name, that sounds cool, so then they name the kid that way. But back then, the meaning of the name was so important because the meaning of the name was a reflection of that person's character, and it would also set the standard for what they were supposed to be like in their lives. So the meaning of the name matters. And what Naomi is doing here is now saying that thing that was supposed to be my character, that thing that was supposed to be who I am, that thing that was supposed to be reflected through my very life, that's not even true. So call me bitter, because that's really how my life is. See, names weren't just descriptions, they were identity. And this is why what Naomi says is so heartbreaking. Because what she did is she allowed all of these things that were happening to become her identity. She allowed the circumstances to define who she was, and then she wore it. And I think we still do this. We allow circumstances, particularly our material ones, to define something about us, right? Or at least to form our identity, right? If we are materially prosperous, we say, we are blessed. We are blessed. In fact, sometimes we even say, yeah, God has blessed me in reference to all of the cool material things that we have. Now, bear in mind, I do believe that we are blessed by God. But we take that on as identity. If our work or our business is successful, we say things like, I am successful, right? But if my business fails, if I fail that test or exam, or if I can't hold the job or whatever it is, then I am a loser, or I am stupid, or I am worthless, and we take these things on. But what exactly was the identity that she developed for herself? She says it right here. She didn't say, call me Mara just because all of these things happened. She says, call me bitter because what? The Lord has made me bitter. She's blaming God. She's blaming God, as we saw before, for all of the things that have gone wrong. But as she blamed God for all of the things that went wrong, she put herself into the place of a victim mentality and a victim identity. Listen, this is something that I say in the house all the time, and it really irritates my kids when I say, you're not a victim. When they start complaining and whining, like, I didn't say I was. I'm like, oh, your attitude's a victim mentality. Suck it up and get to work. Don't be a victim. By the way, they will testify that I really do say that all the time. You can ask them. But why is that such a big deal? Why would I say that to my kids? Why would I make that a big deal? And why is it a big deal for our story? Because the victim mentality, once you take that on as an identity, it absolutely wrecks you. It allows you to place blame instead of accept responsibility, right? And actually make changes that could be good for your life or your spiritual life. But when you're a victim, it allows you to become envious and bitter towards the victimizers. And that's what's happening with Naomi. She's looking at God as a victimizer of her. She's blaming him for all these things. And so the bitterness isn't just something that she wants to be called because all these things that have happened. She actually feels bitterness towards God. And so if we allow ourselves to get to that place, then it puts us at odds with him. He's ignored, or he doesn't care about us. That's why all these things are happening. Or even he's against us. And that relationship starts to break down. The other reason why a victim mentality for us, especially as believers, is because the victim mentality is only here. It only focuses on right now, what's happening here, and it doesn't look at the bigger picture. So if we live our lives like victims, especially in our relationship with God, then we cannot possibly see what he might be doing behind the scenes. It blinds us to our work because all we're worried about is our loss and our tragedies. And that's not to diminish them, but it's to call us to this place of looking at the bigger picture. And by the way, the narrator wants us to know it's time to look at the bigger picture. Why? Because he ends this chapter with this wonderful line. He says, as arriving in Bethlehem, as the barley harvest was beginning. Why is he saying that? This is what's known as a tease, right? It's not a hook, it's a tease. It's setting up something for later on. It's supposed to get our interest in the story. What's happening? When he uses that phrase, beginning, what he's basically cluing us into is something's about to happen. Something's about to happen that Naomi can't possibly see. because she's so myopic in her perspective. She's so focused on all of the tragedy. She's looking at it from a victim mentality perspective, that God's abandoned her, God doesn't care about her, God is judging her, all of these things, and she can't see what's about to happen. But the narrator, from the view of God, is saying, but something is about to happen. Because when she gets back to Bethlehem and it's the beginning of the barley harvest, who do they meet as the wheat farmer? Boaz. That's the power of chapter 1. It's setting up the entire story. So how do we plan this? How do we apply this to our lives, right? Such a beautiful story here. And the author's going to go into even more as we go through. But I believe this morning, God is calling people to recognize He's with you. He hasn't abandoned you. He hasn't forgotten you. He hasn't ignored you. He's calling people in here to recognize that, by the way, He's not judging you. He's not throwing everything at you. You're walking in the mystery of tragedy and redemption. You might not be able to see what He's doing behind the scenes, but this morning God is calling you to a place to walk in faith, to trust Him through all of this. That even though you can't, I'm going to quote the song because I can't help it. Even when I can't see it, you're working. That's the book of Ruth. Let's stand.